The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, on Tuesday dropped a big hint that lots of people's taxes will go up as a result of her budget, which she'll give on the 26th of November. And she dropped this big hint in a quite unusual way by doing a very high-profile speech in Downing Street to journalists and viewers of breakfast television on Tuesday morning. Not the normal way budgets are written. We will discuss what it all means on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And Deputy Economics Editor Dharshini David is here in the studio with me. Hello, Dharshini.
Hello, Adam, and hello, Chris.
Hi.
Dharshini, how many times in your life as an economics correspondent and an economist have you sat down to watch the Chancellor do a speech in Downing Street on national television 3-ish weeks before the budget?
Do you know what? I've been doing over 2 decades of this now. Never grows old. But I don't think I've seen one of those before. And it was quite telling, wasn't it? It really was.
Chris, this was quite an unprecedented kind of intervention, as they'd say in journalese.
Yeah, it was. Normally the airwaves are full of the likes of us three and plenty of others at this stage in the cycle before a budget, i.e. 3 weeks out, talking about, what might be in it and what we're hearing could be in it and the decisions that are being weighed up and all that kind of stuff. And the Chancellor maintains a sort of vow of public silence. And yet she volunteered to kind of enter that arena and also to do it at the time of day that she chose to, which was intentional. It's about reaching audiences at breakfast time who might have caught a bit of it live, of kind of dominating that space in the kind of news agenda and then holding on to it throughout the day in the hope that most people who don't pay a wild amount of attention to politics most of the time pick up a vibe that what is coming is tricky for the Chancellor, but also, crucially from the Treasury's perspective, that people might catch a sense of her justification for what she might be planning. There's an awareness that that justification, that argument, that backdrop as she sees it, tends to get lost on the day. I mean, it's often articulated by a Chancellor, but we're focusing on the fact that it's going to cost X amount more to buy a pint of beer or whatever. And so make the argument now in the hope that the argument makes news, because in 3 weeks' time, it'll be the choices that make news.
We'll break down the building blocks of this speech in a second. But before we do that, Chris, the big takeaway and all the headlines on the news websites are, she didn't rule out raising taxes, which means she is plotting, some might say, to break the Labour Manifesto commitment on not raising the 3 main taxes.
Yeah. So look, I'm going to be kind of candid here about the sort of the tricky nature of political reporting around budgets. And I hear this expressed privately by folk in government. One of the easiest and perhaps arguably laziest, but certainly sometimes also necessary tropes of journalism, and particularly political journalism, is someone like me saying, person X has refused to rule out ... insert big thing. Now, just because they have refused to do that thing doesn't mean that they are about to do it. Obviously, particularly with a budget and those big fiscal decisions, to use the language of the postcode, around taxes and spending, that waits until the day to be announced. Whether it is decided 3 weeks out or not, and I'm told over and over again by folk in the Treasury, they are still weighing up the specifics of various things. However, and I know, as I say, senior figures in government sort of, you're going to write has refused to rule out ... But they also know how this process works and how things will be interpreted. And they know explicitly what they were doing a week ago, and the Prime Minister didn't answer the question from Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, around those big 3 taxes, which he had answered explicitly just a matter of months ago. They actually wanted to go a step further than that in doing what they did this morning, to basically say taxes are going up and here's why we think they have to, even if she didn't say it in quite such blunt terms.
And I'm kind of messing with the timeline now, because newscasters can hear that process, how it played out in the questions and answers after the speech. And here is a question from Mr. Chris Mason to Rachel Reeves, which will let you hear in all its glory just how that process actually worked.
I've got your manifesto here from last year, and on page 21 it says explicitly that Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance, the basic hire or additional rates of income tax or VAT. What do you say to those who have listened to you this morning, and yes, they'll wait for your choices in a few weeks' time, but will say perhaps, crikey, it looks like the Chancellor's about to drive a coach and horses through either that promise or the promise from a year ago not to come back for more.
So I will set out the specific policy choices on the 26th of November, and that's the right thing to do. And we're going through that process and the iterative process with the OBR at the moment, with the forecast and different policy measures. What I want people to understand, and I think it is the right thing and the courteous thing to do, to explain those challenges, but also the principles that will guide me in confronting them, and that's what today's speech is about. There would be a different route through this, as I said in a previous answer. I could say, as I said to Robert, and what previous chancellors did, was, OK, we've got these challenges coming our way. The easy thing to do would be to cut investment in housing, to cut investment in energy security, to cut investment in our transport infrastructure. The reason we have such low productivity today, and the reason why the OBR are updating their forecasts, is because governments have done that for the last 14 years. And that's why we face so many of the challenges we face today.
And also, Dharshini, if we go back to the text of her speech,
Yeah.
what she said in the actual prepared remarks were, if we are to build the future of Britain together, we will all have to contribute to that effort.
Yeah.
Each of us must do our bit.
Yeah, no,
That's the big signal.
Well, it's the big signal, isn't it? And as Chris was indicating there, if you piece together everything we've been hearing in recent weeks, there was no shocks today, but it was definitely landed at a certain time of day to sort of put through a message to people, which is not easy to digest alongside your breakfast. But frankly, what she's saying is this budget is going to be painful. And what she was aiming to do with this, of course, was try and say it's going to be painful. She tried to claim this is not my fault. Now, there's some things which can be laid at previous government's doors. There's some things which this government is accountable for. But there is a purpose for this pain because, this money will be used for public services. We need to boost growth, get the economy on firmer footing. All of those things are debatable. But quite honestly, this was about trying to brace us for those tax rises. As Chris says, there was an indication there, a steer that, things are so grim that I might just have to rip up that manifesto. It is not certain. There are other things she can still do, but we're certainly being primed in a certain direction here.
And Chris, that phrase, we will all have to contribute to that effort, that's code for I'm looking at income tax, isn't it?
Yeah, I think they know that is how that will be interpreted when you have a conversation that is going on privately about whether or not they are willing to do that. And there is a sort of roaring public conversation about the nature of doing that, the historical nature of doing that. You have to go back 50 years since the basic rate of income tax was raised in April 1975 by the Labour Chancellor Dennis Healey. So there's a keen awareness of the kind of conversation that is happening publicly and their contribution into that. But then, as Dharshini was saying, look, you also get, prior to budgets, expectation management, where sometimes the Treasury conclude it is worthwhile sounding a little more doomy than you actually turn out to be, because then when you present stuff that plenty of people might interpret as bad news, the Chancellor can also say, but it's not as bad as you might have thought it would be. So some of that can go on. And then politically, what they're wrestling with here is, how do you confront the challenges that they face and the choices that they're making, so the money that they're spending long-term, investment spending, the decisions that they took last year when they said that they wouldn't come back for more, the nature of the numbers that they're looking at, not least the whole question around productivity, and how that looks pretty bleak. And then how do you avoid, in 12 months' time, being in a very similar position again? And there was a key phrase, I thought, in the opening couple of paragraphs from Rachel Reeves, where she talked about doing things for the years to come. In other words, a trajectory that extended beyond the immediate or even into the sort of medium term. But in political terms, if they decide to put up income tax, and particularly if it is the basic rate and that nod to the sort of sense of it, of all having to do their bit. We should point out that not everyone pays income tax, but it's a tax rise that plenty of people would feel and is much more broad than a lot of these more sector specific tax rises that we've talked about on Newscast plenty of times in the last 14, 15 months or so. If they decide to do that, politically, that is a coach and horses through their manifesto promise, even if there's a counter to it, which I'm hearing increasingly. Is there, for instance, an increase in income tax, but then some sort of decrease in national insurance? That's a possibility that is absolutely there in the ether. But if you do that, you've still smashed the promise. There's no disputing you have smashed the promise. And, you know, speaking to Labour MPs this morning, quite a few of them quite sort of downbeat. One was saying, who's been around this postcode for decades, going back to the Blair and Brown days, yes, there could be tough, but there'd be a rabbit out of the hat that would give us something to cheer about. No sign of any rabbits. And then somebody else said to me, Labour MP, I agree with Kemi Badenoch. And she talked about it being a waffle bomb. I think that was the phrase that she used. So this would be a really hard sell politically, and they know that. They know that if they decide to do this, this will be the sort of thing that their opponents will remind them of every single day until the next general election.
And in fact, we can hear Kemi Badenoch christening that new phrase waffle bomb right now.
This morning, we saw the extraordinary spectacle of a Chancellor just days before a budget rushed into a panicked speech. We were told that this was the great moment when Labour would show they had a plan for growth. Instead, what we got was a masterclass in managed decline. A Chancellor claiming she was just going to set the context, but instead of clarity, business leaders are none the wiser, investors are confused, workers are anxious, because the truth is Labour doesn't have a plan to get Britain working again. The Chancellor's speech was one long waffle bomb. A laundry list of excuses. She blamed absolutely everybody else for her own choices, her own decisions, her own failures.
Sounds like some sort of high calorific Sunday afternoon treat, doesn't it?
Well, I can't tell, is a waffle bomb like a dessert that's quite nice, or like an actual bomb that blows things up in a really innovative way?
I think it seems like a dessert to me.
Yeah.
Do you agree, Dharshini?
I think so. I can see sort of a massive plume of whipped cream and maple syrup and fruit flying everywhere. And I don't know, maybe we just don't get enough excitement.
If any newscasters run a cafe, it would be amazing.
Wouldn't
if
it?
You could put a special of a waffle bomb on the menu at some point between now and the budget.
I reckon it's going to be in 4 digits calorie-wise on the menu.
I know, you have to give them ice cream.
Yes. I'm just thinking about the scoring. You know, the OBR's doing its scoring, the Office of Budget Responsibility. You know.
Okay, so there's a million and one things we could say about this speech, and we've said about 15 of them already. I am struck by something that Matthew Doyle said on Newscast last Thursday, Chris, when you were away.
Oh, yeah.
Matthew Doyle being the former Director of Communications in Downing Street under Keir Starmer, who left a few months ago and who has worked for the Labour Party and many Labour Prime Ministers in the past. And he talked about how this whole process the government's going through now is a debate about the budget with the country and a conversation with people. And I just came away from that going, well, you might think that, but the rest of us just see a speech being given that's trying to prepare some ground. And you realise politicians, when they're doing this sort of thing, they genuinely think they are engaging in a conversation with the country that is going to persuade people. And they are doing that on the basis of that in 3 weeks' time, if they rip up the manifesto pledge on tax, people will feel a little bit more sympathetic to them than if they did it out of the blue. Dharshini, you look sceptical about that. But I think that is how when you're in the trenches in Number 10 Downing Street in the Treasury, that's all you've got, really.
I know, and it's very much a messaging thing, wasn't it? This was meant to land an idea and this is the only option if we want a brighter future.
So that people get used to it.
But, there is much more, as you say, there's 15 million ways we could go with this particular speech. But if you sit back and go, okay, what are we trying to achieve here, right? And we've heard the Chancellor say, we want better public services. And, most people in this country would agree we want better public services. We want to see those improvements. You want the shorter waiting lists. You want to make sure that your kid has the equipment they need in school and a brighter future, et cetera, et cetera. When you look at public sector productivity, not something we talk about very often, that has actually fallen in the last year. The public sector has got less efficient, right? So when we talk about improvements, that's the kind of thing you need to see work on. So there is a different conversation to be had about Are there other ways to do this? And also, how big do we want the state to be? Where does this end? All those kind of things. If you're having a conversation, that's what it actually should be about.
And Rachel Reeves did say she would be looking for waste and efficiency even further in the public sector. So that's code for spending cuts in some places, but like presented as making the public sector leaner and more efficient.
Possibly, or doing more with the same amount of money.
Dharshini, you mentioned productivity in the public sector, but productivity for the economy as a whole, in other words, how much economic value is created by each hour that everyone works every year. Faisal and I had a long chat about this a couple of weeks ago because the Office for Budget Responsibility is doing a big review of how it measures the productivity of the economy.
Yep.
And it sounds like somebody in number 11 Downing Street has seen an advanced copy of that.
Yep.
And it looks like the OBR has come down on kind of the worst end of the spectrum of their revisions.
They have. And this is part and parcel of, those forecasts that we talk about. And the OBR, it goes back and forth between the OBR and number 11. We've made this prediction for the economy and the chancellors can sometimes say, well, actually, I think you're being a bit too pessimistic about this. And it goes back and forth. And there's several rounds of that. And as Chris alluded to earlier, these later rounds are about putting in those budget measures and testing those and seeing where things land. But we do understand that productivity review has been disappointing. Now, we know that our economy has underperformed in recent years. This is no secret, right? We've all been talking about this. We all know that our productivity growth has been pretty woeful for a number of reasons. And all boils down basically to a lack of investment and a lack of investment in the right areas. Now, what we're hearing via various sources is this review is saying actually the assumption that the OBR is going to use is even more grim than previously thought. And the Chancellor likes to say, it's all about Brexit and it's all about austerity. There are many factors here at play. And don't forget, of course, that what she did in last year's budget does appear to be impacting growth at the moment as well. So I'm not saying that there's a huge improvement immediately on the horizon, but this matters to us. Why? Well, not just because you and I will get an extra book to look at on budget day, but because this forms part of their assumptions about the future path of the economy and therefore that potential black hole the Chancellor is going to have to face if she's going
because
to...
a smaller economy or economy firing on fewer cylinders means less tax income, which means trouble for her balance sheet.
Yeah, and as you only have to have a tiny little change in that assumption and it makes millions of pounds of difference.
Or billions of pounds.
Sorry, billions.
Yeah. Chris, this is a slight niche point, but I thought the government was going to be embarking on a blame Brexit roadshow in the build-up to the budget. But actually, Brexit was only a slightly passing reference in the Chancellor's speech today. She didn't go full throttle on blaming Brexit for reduced productivity in the economy.
No, I think where they are psychologically on that, Adam, is to brush by it, is to refer to it. But I think they do it with a slight trepidation because they know part of their argument prior to the last general election was reconvincing folk who may have backed Labour in the past but backed Brexit and might have been disappointed with Labour's outlook on Brexit and the immediate years after it, that they want to brush by it, acknowledge what opinion polls tend to point to, which is a scepticism from plenty about the extent to which Brexit has worked, but not lean into it too heavily. And in fact, the Chancellor, in making that point and a broader one from memory, talked about not wanting to relitigate the past, albeit in a segment where
having
she was
just
doing
relitigated the past.
a fair amount of that. But it's interesting, Adam, the extent to which the government is willing to even brush by the Brexit question, even use the word, has been picked up by the Liberal Democrats, who have been keener to make an argument and are making it more forcefully now, I think, as a result of the government leaning into it a bit, to point out as they see it that they're willing to offer what they argue is a solution around some of the economic questions. They've argued about rejoining the European Union's customs union, and their critique of the government is that they're willing to use the word occasionally but not do enough about it.
Yeah, so basically it's there in size 12 font, not size 48, which you might have expected from some of the briefing in the papers the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Perfect metaphor for me there. Dharshini, government debt. Right? In the 2010s, we were talking about government debt morning, noon and night. Since then, the conversation has come and gone depending on how much the interest rates are in government debt, whether it's shot up a lot because we've had something like, I don't know, a pandemic to deal with. But it does seem like the issue of the government's borrowing costs and the total stock of borrowing
Yeah.
from decades now
Yeah.
has come right back to the front again.
It has, and and this is a point that we've been making several times in this very studio, right? The fact that borrowing costs have become more of an issue, and that's partly because of the way interest rates have moved in recent years. It's because, as you say, the stock of debt has gone up so rapidly, and also because of changes in the way those bond markets operate as well, and the kind of bonds that investors are buying, etc., which has got to do more with the kind of makeup of the pensions market, etc. It's not just about the state of our public finances, but because of that, as the Chancellor was referring to today, and as in fact politicians of most parties talk about this all the time now, it is the unavoidable elephant in the room. Our debt interest costs have been rising very rapidly indeed, and it's one of those things you do have to get a handle on for ethical as well as financial reasons, right? It's not really fair to leave future generations with that to pick up.
And so was this speech intended to kind of get the costs of government borrowing down? Because like the people that lend the government money do respond to things like speeches.
They do, but it's interesting because normally when you have any kind of fiscal event, when you have any kind of significant moment like this, my inbox is pretty full with economists going, look at this and look at what this means and look at how this has changed the picture. It's been silent on that front today, which has been really interesting. This wasn't aimed at the financial markets.
They'd factored a lot of this in already.
We don't have any more numbers than we had at the beginning of the day, right? Everyone in those markets was already assuming the kind of shape and size of tax rises we're talking about. The other thing to crucially remember is that the OBR, when it makes its forecasts, does take a look at the financial markets. It takes a bit of a snapshot. And we're now at that point where it's probably already taken that snapshot. So it's probably too late from the point of view of the Chancellor to influence that and have a meaning on the budget sums.
Yeah, Chris, just before you came into the studio, me and Dharshini were talking about this, and I was like, did Rachel Reeves just do this speech so that the government's borrowing costs today, tomorrow, and the next day would go down a bit? And so that then when the OBR calculates the average cost of borrowing over the last couple of months, she's saved herself a couple of £1 billion. And then Dharshini said, no, the forecasting period or the review period for bond yields has closed from the OBR.
We think.
So my theory survived about 5 seconds.
It's a wonderful Adam Fleming-esque.
That's my small talk.
I love how you lean into it.
Yeah, no, this is great.
Chris, just
I'm here for more of it.
On the politics of government debt, what do you want to say about the politics around that? Because she started using this phrase, which I personally don't like because it's not very precise and it's not necessarily how government debt works, because government debt doesn't work like personal debt. She says paying down the debt, which sounds like me going, okay, I will not buy an expensive sandwich for lunch today so that I can pay off my credit card. That's what paying down the debt in your own life means. I'm just wondering what you think about it in a government political context today.
Yeah, so two thoughts. Firstly, on the kind of communication stuff, I think welcome to the dilemma that any kind of chancellor or public figure in economics, and Dharshini, I'd be fascinated on your take on this, wrestle with, which is how are you simultaneously scrupulous around economic accuracy, but also you're communicating to a mass audience who are eating their Rice Krispies and hearing a chancellor, as our colleague Matt Chorley pointed out, who managed to make a reference to her May's lecture at a point when, maybe Good Morning Britain or Breakfast TV are dipping in live and people are thinking, what on earth is that a reference to?
Very high fibre breakfast cereal?
Well, yes. Maybe do you have your May's lecture for breakfast and then a waffle bomb for afternoon,
Sounds like an ideal budget day.
Treat. So there's that dilemma that I think anyone in kind of public life faces around how they choose to communicate. On the bigger picture point about debt, and I hear this privately as well as publicly, and they've been consistent around this to a greater or lesser extent since they took office. Really, is that fear about it not being in control and the amount of money that it is costing in terms of servicing the debt, how we are seen on the international markets in terms of buying debt, borrowing, in other words. There's a really keen awareness on that, and I think in terms of their attempt to land that in a human sense, there was repeated references, wasn't from the Chancellor, about what was the figure? £1 in every 10, I think, being spent on debt interest, not paying down the debt, but merely servicing the interest charges against it.
And I suppose actually, Dharshini, saying paying down the debt as your objective, that's just a slightly pithier way of repeating Rachel Reeves' own fiscal rules.
It is that secondary fiscal rule.
Yeah, which is that debt as a share of the overall economy, which is just a way of measuring it rather than anything else, will be falling at the end of a 4/5 year period on the basis of the decisions that she will make now.
Yes, indeed, which in itself is one of those accounting things you think is easily fudgeable. And
because your debt could be increasing as long as the economy is growing faster.
Exactly, and which is why, you see a lot of economists tearing their hair out and going, well, we don't never talk meaningfully about the fact getting debt down in the longer term. How are we going to do that? All of that seems to be by the by. Interesting that point, though, that Chris was making about communications as well, because it is hard, right? We all know it's hard to land these messages with people and you try and break it down into simple terms. But ultimately, government debt is very different indeed from household debts. And frankly, governments do have options that households do not.
Except Rachel Reeves was also saying there's a limit to how much the government can borrow because it's not free.
It's not free. No, it's not free. And they do, the way they're structured at the moment, they do pay interest on it, et cetera, and they have a responsibility to us to do something about it. One thing that, she talked about in the speech, which we've not really touched on, is the fact that she talked about, we need to sort of boost growth. And this is my aim. I'm going to boost growth. I'm going to get the debt down. I'm going to get public services going. When we talk about these tax rises, doesn't matter where it comes from, whether it's income tax and breaking that manifesto pledge or finding a whole basket of other smaller bits around the side, you're taking money out of the economy, right? So you are going to hit pockets. You are likely to hit profits as well, which makes it more challenging to boost growth. But unless you boost growth, we're going to be back here having the same conversation, aren't we, in future years?
As people said, Rachel Reeves would be doing anyway long before the election.
Yeah.
Chris, last question to you. Last time I saw you, we were interviewing Kemi Badenoch here in the Newscast studio on Monday morning. Nigel Farage, at that exact point, was giving a speech in the city about Reform UK's economic policy, which was also quite a lot about their public spending policy on things like public sector pensions. Now that you've had a chance to listen to that speech, compare it with what Kemi Badenoch was saying to us, what Rachel Reeves was saying this morning, what do you think of the politics of what Nigel Farage has been doing?
So I think there's an element of, to a degree at least, and perhaps none of those three parties, Labour, Conservative or Reform, would appreciate this, but there's an element of clustering going on. And hear me out on this. In other words, what Reform are wrestling with is that they have found themselves, relatively speaking, in the blink of an eye, being treated in the Westminster conversation as a potential prospective next government. And that is a wildly different place, to put it gently, from where they were when they were campaigning at the last general election. And there was that whole business about, will Nigel Farage stand? And he's become the leader again, and all that kind of stuff, where they were clearly, in the grand scheme of things, a minor player, even if their role in particularly inflicting additional pain on the Conservatives was substantial. To get to the point, what they are doing now is thinking, hang on a minute, what were we arguing for as a party of opposition in the melee that isn't really economically credible? And now they say that the situation has been made worse by 14 months of a Labour government. But what they were doing yesterday is shaking off something they had concluded was incredible, which was the scale of those tax cuts that they were advocating. I think what is interesting, and we will get more of, because they will face a compulsion to do this if they continue to ride as high in the polls as they have been for a while, is fleshing out the specifics about how they would do some of those things that Nigel Farage riffed on yesterday. So how would they reform public sector pensions? How would they get the benefits bill down? How would they reduce the size of the civil service? Newscasters will have views as to whether those are good or bad ideas, but there's a journalistic obligation that will come when we get the chance in the coming months, as they set out the detail, about the practicalities of how they go about doing that. Not least because they said they would only get to the point where they could think about significant tax cuts if they achieved all of the above. Well, to a greater or lesser extent, other political parties have had desires broadly in those spaces in recent years and have not necessarily managed to achieve them. That's not to say another party might not be able to, but how they then sort of sit in that space. And then to fast forward to Kemi Badenoch and her speech this morning, this is her again stepping into the space around economic credibility, and the Conservatives think that they have a comparative advantage, relatively speaking, and there's some polling evidence to back this up to a degree, that compared with Labour and Reform, people are perhaps beginning to be willing to give them a hearing on the economy. Some might find that quite surprising given the relative recency of Liz Truss, etc., etc. But there is some polling evidence to point towards that. And I think that's why Kemi Badenoch has gone into that space, talking about welfare and talking about the economy and talking about tax in the way that she did this morning. So that was probably a really long and rambling answer, but there you go.
Well, I did ask you to sum up three main political parties in one go, so I brought it on myself. Right, I'm going to end with one last metaphor that potentially sums up today. Bear with me, okay? So in this metaphor, Katy Perry is Rachel Reeves. Justin Trudeau is potential tax rises on lots of people. Today was Katy Perry and Justin Trudeau in the restaurant in Canada being snapped by the paparazzi.
Oh, I see.
In other words, the soft
Ooh.
launch.
Yeah.
Yep.
The budget is Katy Perry and Justin Trudeau snogging on the yacht.
Right. I was thought you were going to say I wasn't. Yeah, you've gone for the more sort of, if you like, paparazzi moment. I was thinking you were going to talk about when they'd walked out of that. Was it somewhere in Paris?
It
Where
was
were they?
Paris, yeah.
For her birthday.
Yes,
Yes.
in the full dress.
Although when I went to see Katy Perry, she picks three people out of the audience, one of whom was a middle-aged man who wanted to marry her, and she said to him, "Sorry, you're 48 hours too late."
Oh.
I'm not suggesting she got married to Justin Trudeau in secret. I'm just saying she very much confirmed it to me
To you.
and 22,000 other people.
Right. Heard it here first. Wow.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's me trying to get a Six Music podcast. As if that would be on Six Music. Wouldn't even be on Radio 2. Right. Dharshini, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Chris, thanks to you too.
Thank you.